Greetings and welcome to an educational otherwise, an occasional conversation series where we dream together in public about teaching and learning for collective futures. I am Django Paris, and I'm really grateful to be on these beautiful Coast Salish lands this morning. I am here in the Bank Center for Educational Justice in the College of Education at the University of Washington, and really thrilled to be joined by two wonderful people this morning, educators, scholars, community members, two folks I've learned a lot with, particularly across these last 5 years about critical disability studies, about disability justice with young children and families in and far beyond schooling. So thank you both for that ongoing teaching and learning in my own life and in my own work. More officially, joining us are Maggie Beneke, who's an associate professor working in the areas of critical disability studies, early childhood, teacher education, and doctoral education here in the College of Education at the University of Washington. Maggie is also affiliated faculty with us in the Bank Center for Educational Justice, and more generally, a valued co-conspirator in justice and liberation work alongside students and communities. So thank you so much for being here, Maggie. Also here joining us is Jordan Taitingfong, a doctoral student here in the college, focusing also on critical disability studies. Jordan has done much work with children, families, and preparing and practicing early childhood educators here in the Seattle area. I first started learning with Jordan some years ago amongst a particularly amazing group who took the culturally sustaining pedagogies class. And Jordan, really learned a lot from you about better honoring disability in my own teaching and learning that quarter and beyond. So thank you. Really grateful to be in community with you both today, especially as we navigate these dire times and push for a beautiful otherwise. So I thought we might sort of get started at the beginning or somewhere along the journey for each of you. And might start by maybe each of you just taking a moment to share how you came to this work of critical disability studies generally and ideas and enactments of disability justice more specifically. Why and how this became part of your life and your life's work. Maggie, you want to just kind of get us started here, if that sounds okay?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Django, for the invitation and for this question. So I think one way to answer this is that I was with the disability as a young child, and in part for being too loud in my early elementary classroom, and I had an IEP. I was removed from the classroom for intervention to learn to whisper. I went to whisper training,
Wow.
which was like totally gendered. And the response was to fix me. Instead of sort of thinking about what my unmet needs were or what my questions were or what I was trying to express. And
That's
at
right.
the time I really, internalized, I felt humiliated. But I think that over time I've been able to process that experience and recognize sort of the way that my forms of expression were pathologized, and also the way that my whiteness protected me in being sort of further funneled out of the classroom. So I was able to perform smartness in particular ways, and to navigate educational systems that in ways that as a teacher, many of the children that I worked with were not. So I was a teacher of young children in the Boston and Chicago areas for 8 years, children with and without disabilities, many of whom were children of color, speaking multiple languages. And I was just blown away by their savvy and brilliance, and felt really challenged to see how the system was sort of set up to rank and categorize them and devalue the ways that they showed up in the world, and also blown away by the ways that they were making sense of that too, like how they see that labeling process and in relation and processing who they were in relation to one another.
Mm.
And so I really, yeah, so, and then I came to critical disability studies as a doctoral student, which really sort of helped me understand some of my own experiences as a teacher and as a child, particularly the ways coming to disability critical race theory and being mentored by Subani Anima around the ways that racism and ableism intersect, how ableism is often a tool that white supremacy leans on, right?
Right.
To that racism operates by devaluing and pathologizing bodies, minds, and behaviors.
Mm.
And that that we have to center folks who are experiencing multiple forms of oppression in order to imagine liberation. And we also, the other thing that disability critical race theory helped me with was thinking about resistance and the power of resistance and activism. And that's really how I landed in thinking about disability justice and the work of,
Right.
Alice Wong, Talila Lewis, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Valissa Thompson, Patty Byrne, Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasina, Lydia X.C. Brown, folks who have really been thinking about, what it means to honor multiply marginalized folks, disabled folks' wholeness and really sustaining disabled communities. And so I'm still thinking about this. I feel like I'm in
Yes, that's right.
and it's ongoing work. And I think, but thinking about what disability justice might look like and mean in education, I think is where I'm at right now. In a way that isn't co-opting some of that movement work and organizing framework, but thinking in solidarity with folks about growing
Right.
disability justice and moving alongside. So I'll end there, and Jordan, if there's other things that you want to say or to riff on
Mm-hmm.
that I've shared, please do.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about as you're thinking and getting ready to share, Jordan, is how much so many of us have learned from Subani's work and from that discrit work, and so thinking of you and your work as part of that sort of legacy and trajectory, Maggie and many of the folks that you work with, and then those of us who learn alongside you, learning with that work as well. Really, really appreciating that, and also appreciating the sort of the scope or the thinking about over time how you've experienced this work and come to join this work. I think that's really useful for so many of us. So Jordan, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. It's so interesting I've heard this from Maggie before, but it's also so interesting to hear it again because there's so much that's similar, even though, and the way that our intersectionality plays out ended up
Mm-hmm.
different. But I really come to this work through what you're talking about with discrit and thinking about Subani's work and that intersectionality of race and disability and racism and ableism. And it's something that's been really salient in my own lived experience and then watching the experiences of the kids and families that I've worked with, right? So like many folks and families that are Chamorro Arangwa, my family is associated with the military. So my dad was in civil service when I was young,
Mm-hmm.
and I went to school at a Department of Defense school. I lived off the base because we weren't officially military, but I went to school on the base, which
Right.
was an interesting thing to experience. But that school, I had Black male teachers in elementary school immediately. I
Right.
had really diverse classrooms, racially diverse classrooms, if they weren't economically diverse, because we were all military kids.
Right.
And in that setting, I was considered a gifted, and I'm putting that in quotes,
Mm-hmm.
kid. And I was really given these incredible opportunities to experience being curious and choose what I wanted to learn. And I was told that I was smart. And like Maggie talked about smartness, right? I was told that I was
Right.
so smart. And then in middle school, I moved to a tiny town in northern Washington where I was one of 2 kids of color in the school. And I experienced a lot of racism. And I understood that, right? And the racism that I was experiencing from my peers, I knew what that was. My dad's Chamorro. That side of my family's from Guam, and my mom's white.
Right.
And I experienced a lot of racism about my parents being together, about the way I looked, all these things. But the racism that it took me, the racism and ableism in that intersection took me longer to understand. And these
Right.
tools that I've come to as an adult have helped me understand it so much more, especially in the ways that I was experiencing that from my teachers. Suddenly, the exact same behaviors that I was doing before, where I was questioning things and super curious, were now bad.
So the
Right?
gifted things became the bad things.
Exactly. Like now you are questioning authority, and now you are troubled and a troublemaker, and you can't speak up in class. You can't question these things, right? And so
Probably need whisper training.
I know
Yeah,
exactly.
right. The racialization of like brilliance.
Yeah, right. And just like this, and being, you know, a middle schooler, which is such a confusing time already, but then being like, I didn't change. Like, what
That's right.
I'm doing these exact same things. What is not okay about this now, right? And really understanding and coming as an adult to T.L. Lewis's work around ableism and Subini's work has really made that clear to me. And then when I became an educator, I taught preschool and kindergarten with kids with and without disabilities. I really saw the exact same thing playing out, right? Where I would have these white boys in my class who were having the exact same behaviors as these Black boys in my class. And they would come in with these diagnoses that were autism versus a behavior disorder, right? It's anxiety, or like you need to change the way that you're talking to them, versus like you got to change this kid, right? And I was just seeing that play out so clearly with these students and families and trying to support them that I wanted to understand the theory behind it and understand like other adults' lived experiences. I think in early childhood, we also get really caught in just that little box. And so learning from disabled adults.
Yeah, I think
significant.
yeah, it's one of those things, right? Whereas sometimes as an educator, the way that the system is designed, these nation state schools are designed to have like one or maybe a couple of adults and then a bunch of young people or whatever the age is. It really, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. You two are drawing, so helping us, you know, understand so quickly this link between racism and ableism. I know that, you know, my own ongoing learning from you both, from many folks, once you see that, and you're saying seeing it as a child and then seeing it as an educator, you can't unsee it, and suddenly so much becomes clearer. Where you were trying to say this is racism, or you were trying to say this is homophobia or sexism or patriarchy or cis heteronormativity or right or monolingualism or, you know, class. These are these things, and they are all those things, and you can't understand them without also understanding ableism. And so that to me was, you know, it continues to be this, you know, trying to open up that understanding in a way that really helps us see clear, work clear, live clear. I'm also thinking, Jordan, of your conversation, you know, of the gifted. So I was gifted in 4th grade, and then by the time I got to high school, I was in the basic track. So I'm not sure what happened. I became ungifted.
Like, right? Like, and there's something in there about other people's perceptions and the ideas of how we like perform being smart, right? Between like, also between grade levels, right?
Yeah.
That's so significant there.
And what you're talking about too is the moving of spaces, of places, and then who are those hopefully caring adults? What is the community? What is, you know? So maybe we could spend a little bit of time now that you've offered those really you know, important understandings of your own trajectories of living and understanding, thinking a little bit about some of your current work. And so Jordan, you recently published just a couple of months ago, maybe, or maybe less than that, a letter in the journal Language Arts. And the letter's entitled Making Inclusive Literacy Spaces, Resisting Ableism and Honoring Disability. And I definitely recommend folks find that letter. I really appreciate letters as ways of communicating directly. But so find that letter if you can. Toward the end of the letter, you do a little bit of dreaming about early elementary classrooms you hope for, and you come to the line, quote, however, that means today and now we get our resistance in wherever we can, end quote. And then you also share, quote, I'm excited by the idea of more teachers explicitly sharing and creating classroom values around disability and resisting ableism. I am hopeful of the ways children who learn early will resist and reimagine our teaching spaces, end quote. And so can you talk a little bit about this idea of getting our resistance in wherever we can? That really struck me. And then also those hopes and dreams of reimagined teaching spaces that center and sustain disabled students and families.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was excited to have the opportunity to do that and to kind of address people directly, because I do that in my work too, right? Where it's like, how do we get this thing moving? And here we are, and how do we move forward? And I think that's a big part of it, right? We are working towards a more libertarian idea of education. We're working towards this, but what do we do right now? Because we know it's not where we are. And we're required to do so many things that are against our beliefs, especially in special educators, right? So I think IEPs or individualized education plans are a perfect example of that. You know, there are these legal documents that we create for any kid in our class who qualifies and has a disability, and it's so focused on what kids can't do along this idea of what is normal and expected, and that is so influenced by whiteness and general ideas of ability, right? And so it's really important that we think about the ways that we can resist. And even I talk to a lot of teachers about in writing IEPs, right? In thinking about, instead of being hyper-focused on independence, how can we push interdependence into this document, right? How can we rewrite some of these things? How can we think about collectivism instead of independence, which is really honoring those disability justice principles too?
Right.
Thinking about like how we share this document with families. Like, it's often the longest meeting that you have with a family, the most time that you spend one-on-one talking about their kid. And again, it's about why they qualify, all the things that they can't do that are expected.
Kind of what's the problem?
Right, exactly. And, you know, talking to teachers, and something that I did was like, how do we introduce this document as a way to resist what might happen to their kids in the future too, right? How they might be, we know suspension and expulsion for disabled kids in early childhood is the highest across the age. So how do we use this document to protect kids too? How do we talk to families about their legal rights within this system that's unfair, right? And I think that tied with that, in that reimagining classrooms, we still live in this society that thinks it's okay to segregate kids based on ability, right?
Right.
It's okay to have a fully segregated classroom. And we know that with that intersection
even if they're all black and brown.
Exactly, right? We know that that's what ends up happening, right? These behavior disorder classrooms, or these behavioral classrooms, are predominantly black and brown boys that have been pathologized, right? And so something I hear a lot too is when we come up with creative ways for kids to be in community and learn in our own spaces. Like, I think teachers are really protective of our own spaces, right? Especially if we feel like we're doing this inclusion and liberatory work. There's this thing about that I hear from admin a lot about, like, well, that the school next year won't do that for them, right? Or that's not the real world, right?
Oh, of course.
A lot of teachers, I feel like, if you're getting that response, you're on the right track. Like, you are resisting in a way that's important. I don't want it to be like what you're saying.
If this is the real world, I think I'm going for something different.
Exactly. Like, I'm not shooting for that, you know, like
Yeah.
what I want kids to experiencing something powerful about who they are now, right?
Yep.
And understanding their disability and understanding the creativity in disability and having that honored and centered in a classroom is so powerful. And I think
Hmm.
about, like, in the same example of my own experience growing up, like I am more disabled now as an adult than I was when I was younger. I was diagnosed with a brain disorder when I started the doc program, actually the first
Yeah,
week of our class.
I
Django was when
remember
I
that,
first
Jordan. Yeah,
started going through
yeah.
all my testing and stuff. And
Hmm.
it does affect my thinking and the speed at times of which I can do things. And, you know, I'm chronically ill. And
Hmm.
even with all of this learning and understanding, I didn't have a long experience of people like honoring that in me, right? Or
Hmm.
honoring my experiences and making community fit for what I was experiencing. And I think that if we can give that to young children, they can
Right.
take that with them in the real world, you
That's
know?
right. That's right. And necessarily transform the real world as they do it, because they're doing it in a with a different set of understandings of how, you know, what the relations are at play.
Exactly. And it's so
You,
important for
yeah,
non-disabled and disabled kids.
I was going to say, it
yes.
makes me think about the sort of the messy work too, of like, how do we negotiate this in classrooms, so that it's not just like about um,
Hmm.
in the rights to individual services or supports for
Yeah.
particular children, but like, how do we talk with groups of children about people's needs being met,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And and building that community together, and that's messy, right? There are sometimes competing needs, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's also the work of like being a human in this
Mhm.
world,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Well, I think too, when you're talking about the messy work, and you're talking about that, you know, the maybe the administrator, whoever said that's not the real world, or it's not going to be this way forward, you know, it brings to mind sort of abolitionist ideas of you know, knowing the thing now is not the thing we need doesn't mean we know all the things we need. It means we know that we need very different things.
Yeah.
And we know,
Yeah.
and we do know some of them, because people that you've already mentioned have been doing work for decades and centuries, right?
Yeah.
And so I really I honor that, you know, getting your resistance in, and this messy work. I'm also thinking about what you shared, Jordan, around sort of like what it means to be a state agent as an
Mhm.
educator, in a sense, right? Like
Mhm.
what, and that sort of real tension, or as, you know, in some ways as a professor in a, you know, public university. And so what does it mean
Yep.
when we come up against the state, and its boundaries and barriers, policies, and we could kindly say processes, often, you know, many of which are violent, for trying to get work done, trying to care for young children, trying to care for ourselves and families. Um, and so much of what you were talking about, you know, is really the opposite of its deficit, and, you know, to use, you know, Eve Tuck's framing, damage centered, where, you know, we're working toward a strength and wisdom based, right,
Mhm.
understanding. And so as you both are sharing, there's so many connections that I'm making also to these other bodies of work, some of which also haven't taken, not that, you know, anything I've just mentioned, but haven't taken up disability and disability justice in really generative ways. I'm thinking of my own earlier work, for instance. Um, but you're bringing it in a way that not only invites us to, but says we can't really do otherwise,
Mhm.
and I really appreciate that. Um, so Maggie, Jordan was talking a little bit about independence and interdependence, and I
Mhm.
know that you all are working on this project
Mhm.
along with your long-term collaborator and our friend Emily Machado.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the current collaborations is entitled "Beyond Independence: Young
Mhm.
Children and Families Processing the Pandemic and Constructing Care in a Virtual Writing Art Workshop." Maybe you can share, if it's useful, kind of around the ideas that are importantly swirling in our conversation. If you could share a little bit about these ideas of interdependence and care,
Mhm.
as young children and families navigate what you all are framing as converging social crises.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, as you were reading that, I was like, working title. Maybe that's a little long.
I was gonna say working title, but I didn't want to, go there. But I think we have the idea. The ideas are out there.
Yeah,
Interdependence, sort of collective care,
yeah,
converging
it
social
is what it is.
crises.
Yeah, we got it. We'll put them together. Mash up. Um, yeah, so I think this project was began in June 2020.
Oh
Um,
wow, yeah,
and and we carried it out during much of the lockdown during the
right,
early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it began as Jordan and Emily and I really just wanting to, at the time I also was home with my two young children, just wanting to
that's
create a
right,
space for um, kids and families to process what was happening around us, and also to just be a supportive space. And so it, uh, we began with sort of a focus really on the pandemic and thinking about community care. And we carried out 20 sessions with um, children, between young children and their families, children of color, multilingual children, children with disabilities. And we shipped families giant boxes of art supplies and markers and
yes,
paper and clay, and invited, sort of just had open-ended invitations for
oh
families and
wow,
kids to create and to process sort of what was happening, and to share out, if they wanted to, what they had made. And they really are, we began focusing like sort of on their understandings of the pandemic, their noticings about community change and care, and their thoughts about a post-pandemic world. And then, as you mentioned, like there was the pandemic
yeah,
was happening, but then there was also like the movement, racial uprisings and the movement for
right,
Black lives. That it was a summer where, in Washington State, the sky was orange because of smoke and climate
that's
crises,
right,
ongoing
Mhm.
crises.
that's right,
So we had to continue to be sort of responsive to the moment and tailor our invitations to create space for children and families to process all that was
that's right,
happening and converging, and recognizing also for us like that disability, ableism is also disability justice is also a climate justice issue.
yeah, that's right,
This is
Yeah.
also a racial justice issue, like thinking about how
yeah,
George Floyd, for instance, was like, how
yeah,
ableism operated to to portray him as hyper aggressive, right? And so I
right,
think,
oh wow,
yeah, so
mhm.
recognizing how we our invitation sort of opened up space for families and kids to sort of grapple with these in whatever way that was happening for them, and the ways that they were sort of showing up in the moment. And I wanted to share sort of three kind of stories
Oh
about
perfect,
care and interdependence happening. And so um, and I think these stories speak back to sort of what school often does, in starting from the moment kids begin, which is prioritizing
hmm
kids' acquisition of decontextualized skills that uphold these notions of normalcy that
uh-huh.
been offered us, and that school often then leverages sort of carceral logics to manage kids in acquiring these skills, right?
Right.
There it is,
As an individual independent activity, right? And so we were
yes,
sort of looking at how, in the
really a
context,
settler logic, yeah,
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 settler
Mhm.
logic in the context of these, thank you for that. Yeah, in the context
Yeah.
of these workshops, how um uh
Mhm.
kids and families meaning making was inherently interdependent, happening between them and drawing on a range of resources around them,
That's right.
including the art materials that we shared, and that they were actively making meaning of their social political worlds, even though sort of school and just society in general often positions children as like not yet ready or not knowing.
too
Right.
innocent. You can't, it's something about innocence there, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And
We'll
who
we'll
also,
do this later.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
right,
We'll get
yeah,
to this later. It's like, what?
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, so one example was Lily, a 6-year-old multilingual child with Down syndrome, who was drawing a picture of a person outside and represented the person's face was wearing a mask. And this led to a conversation with Carmen, Lily's mom, who said, when I go to the store, I say, okay, hija, I'm going to the store. And she's with her dad and she says, Mama, your mask. So she knows that something's happening and it's important to use
Mhm.
a mask. And she says, remember the virus. Sometimes people might think she's not paying attention, but she knows. So it's Mama, your mask, the virus. And I don't know if
Mhm.
she could articulate it, but she knows something's happening. And so that was something that we saw sort of across the project was this idea of like, but she knows,
Yeah.
recognizing their children's meaning making surrounding the pandemic. And also that recognition being mutual, right? That Lily was also expressing care for her mother and
That's
community,
right.
reminding them to wear a
Yeah,
mask, right? And
yeah.
rooted in assumptions that wearing one was important for collective well-being. Um, and a second example was, and I'll just try to say this briefly, but this there was also these multiple instances of refusal that were happening in the workshop,
Mhm.
and um, and one of the best moments, we finished the workshop session, and Emily was like, "That was a disaster," and I was like, "What happened?" And it took place in sort of in the first week following the racial uprisings surrounding George Floyd's murder, and
Mhm.
uh, it was with Luca, a 6-year-old Latino boy whose mother described as socially delayed in relation
Mhm.
to what school had labeled him, and he basically refused to participate in the workshop on the screen and just walked out of the room. And
I like
the
this person already.
I
yeah,
mean, how many times do you wish you could have done that when we were first
yeah,
starting out on Zoom?
the thing that exactly the thing that was really cool though was that his mom Jimena gave him her phone and logged him into Zoom on her phone, and he just like on his own like went. So he's like zooming in
Yeah.
on his phone. He goes
Yeah.
all the way, walks down the stairs outside to like this cardboard fort that his dad had constructed for him outside.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And he and in the meantime, like it created space for Jimena to compose a poem about refusal of the status quo. She titled it Basta, around sort of enough around and processing her
Yeah.
place within the movement for Black lives and racial justice more broadly. And so what we saw was that like sort of Luca's refusal created space for Jimena to compose, but she also he also was like able to participate in his own way uh by using the phone. So Jimena created space for Luca to sort of refuse these normative participation expectations. And he was able to share with us this cool fort that his dad had built with
Yeah.
him in his neighborhood in his own way. And so I think actually I'll just stop there for time, but I think these
Yeah.
two stories show kind of how um what was happening in our workshop is sort of speaks back to this myth that children learn skills on their own, sitting silently at desks, right? That kids and families were processing the converging social crises around them, and that that kids weren't just in need of care in the midst of the tragedy, but were also agentively enacting care for one another and their families.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah. And which really contrasts sort of the rigidity that we often see in early childhood, and offers us sort of some provocations to think about what we might do in early education and school more broadly.
Oh, those are just such beautiful examples. Jordan, is anything coming to mind or heart for you as you're hearing these?
Yeah, I mean, I think just really like how generative it was, right? And how ready, like we talked about, like this, like what you said, like we'll get to it later, right? But it
Yeah.
ignores the fact that we are all living through this. Kids are living through this too, right? They are having their lived experience, and they have knowledge of how to see the world. And they, like, you know, we can learn so much in community, right? And creating that collective access, that idea that, you know, mom may have needed space to write that piece, and he needed space to not be having these demands placed on him, right?
Yeah, right.
And something really beautiful did come out of that, right?
And was happy to participate in some other way.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that that's not, you know, in early childhood especially, there's so much pressure about getting kids ready for kindergarten, getting kids ready for, you know, learning. You're learning to learn in preschool, right? And we're taking play away from kids when we do that. And in this instance, you just see like how generative that is, and how much we can miss if we're not letting people be who they are.
Right, and I mean, so many things are disrupted, refused, renegotiated, or re-related in these examples, where you have like, okay, you're this age, you need to learn this thing in this way here. This is the subject or matter or the discipline that you're learning about, and suddenly you've got all these things going on, which is how we know learning actually happens. And so, yeah, these are such beautiful examples. They also make me feel very hopeful, also because they offer us sort of glimpses of the otherwise we're reaching for. And I think that's ultimately what so much of many of our work is about, is like, let's find it, let's join it, let's feel it, let's try to amplify it or grow it more.
Yeah.
And so I was too thinking, yeah, Maggie, as you were sharing about, I remember when Michelle Jacob, the Yakima educator, teacher, educator, writer, when she was here a couple of years ago, and she shared this in different ways at different times, but, you know, kind of talking about the settler logics of individualism, individual accountability, so on and so forth, right? Obviously extraction of the land, dispossession, are so baked into education systems, nation state education systems, but that they're so new on these lands, and that these, you know, understandings of interdependence and of collective care, of care and relationship with the land, are so much have been here, you know, since time immemorial. And so I'm thinking a lot about these convergences that we're talking about, these intersections that we're talking about, and how much there is to learn across communities and across spaces, and that can be done in a good way, that helps us forward. So I just really, I can't wait to see whatever it's titled by the time you start sharing it more officially. I really am and I'm so thankful that you chose to share those examples, because I think that's when it comes to life for so many of us, right? So maybe we'll just kind of make one more move in this conversation, and it really is connected to sort of these convergences, the converging social crises, from, you know, the climate crisis catastrophe to ongoing movements for racial justice, for decolonization, for really an otherwise world. And so I'm thinking about those, that you were just talking about, that summer of 2020 is, I think, really important, because for many of us, I can speak for myself, I think it was a time when I'll just speak for myself. I was coming to a better awakening, a necessary awakening, a far too late awakening about following the leadership of disability justice activists and folks during that time, about collective care, about mutual aid, things that folks in disability justice have been about always, and other movements and other communities as well have been about for a long time, and intersecting communities, obviously. And so that was a time when that was so present in so many ways. And now, here we are thinking about genocides from Congo to, from the Congo to Sudan to Palestine. And it has me thinking about the necessary work of the Disability Visibility Project, which I know both of you know well. One of you may have passed it along to me at some time. Their eSIMs for Gaza project, which has been so important and raised so much money for folks to have access to communication. And I'm thinking about Leah Lakshmi Pipsna Samarasina's recent essay, Palestine is Disabled, where they write, quote, "I'm going to say it again for the people in the back, disability justice has always been about Palestinian liberation, period. Disability justice," they write, "was founded by a bunch of revolutionary disabled people, mostly BIPOC, who had been involved in radical movements against imperialism and racism for all of their lives. We created disability justice out of our lived disabled experiences with war, occupations, and genocide. A free Palestine," they write, "is a disability justice issue. Disability justice will not win without a free Palestine, where disabled people live in a land that is at peace, where we get to just be," end quote. And so, I mean, powerful, necessary, beautiful, and painful, difficult words. And I wonder if you might share what these, powerful words, enactments, dreamings bring up for you in your own work, teaching, life, and organizing, as we think about sort of these stories of Lily and Luca in the here and now.
Yeah.
Go for it, Jordan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or anything that's, yeah, I know it's a lot, but I feel, when I was reading that essay and then rereading it again last night, and and just looking at the work of the Disability Visibility Project, really, which I think started to come to it for me in probably around 2020, started to read, like, what's going on over there? Oh my God. What's wrong with me? Yeah, holy shit. This is the, what the heck is wrong with me? And then some months ago, Kelly Hayes had Leah Lakshmi on the movement memos, and that was a really important episode. I think we listened to it last year in our CSP class. So kind of things that are coming up for you or going on for you around this or the moment.
Yeah, I've learned so much from Leah over time, and I think that that's a part of it too, is like, I'm watching the way that people are engaging with these multiple crises and this ongoing genocide.
Right.
And like my friends, my colleagues, activists that are Palestinian, we're able to watch people directly on our phones. We're watching war happening directly on our phones. We're watching the way that people are engaging. And there's so much education and knowledge and knowing at our fingertips right now, and ways of resisting and examples and ways of resisting. And I think of like Imani Barbarin also, who I follow on all social media, talking about and making all these connections and weaving them all together for us. And it's really important for ways that we think about sustainability too, which is another principle of disability justice, is watching and learning about how these people, watching them sustain themselves in these times that when we talk about hope and things can feel hopeless, you know, like I have
Right.
seen some of the most horrific things I've ever seen in my life
I know.
in the past couple months. And like
I know.
watching people continue to live and strive and fight, and you know, and the ways like how can we choose anything other than figure out how to sustain ourselves and each other, right?
That's
And I
right.
think about that in our organizing work and that collective liberation piece, right? And that's another principle. There's no body or mind left behind, which means we have to see all that is happening around us.
Holy smokes. Yeah.
And understand that if we are not leaving anybody behind, my freedom and your freedom are so intertwined, and those are things that scholars have been talking about forever, right?
Thinking
But
of the
it's just,
Combahee River Collective as you're talking here. Yeah.
exactly. But how do we see it so clearly in this moment? And I think for my own life and my own work too, like learning so much about settler colonialism and colonization and what Palestine has experienced historically has also brought me to pushing to understand more about my own ancestry, right?
And about Guam, absolutely.
Guam, yeah.
Yeah.
And the ongoing crises with the militarization and the push for freedom and independent Guam that like Banatsu group is doing. And you know, my cousin and my sister and some other folks have been really connected to trying to teach more Chamorro language to people living in the diaspora and on the island, right? When colonization happened, that language was pushed out, and with militarization and the occupation of the US, that language was pushed out. I didn't get to learn it as a kid. But now, as an almost 40-year-old, I can learn it, and I can see how important it is for me to learn, right? As I'm watching all these other people resist the loss of their culture and fight.
That's right.
And prove that it will continue, that we will still be here, right?
Thank you, Jordan. Maggie, anything coming to mind? Yeah.
Couple of things. One of the things, just a couple.
Yeah, I know. It's like, what isn't?
What isn't coming to mind? What you were just sharing, Jordan, makes me think about that tweet by writer and activist Patty Krawick around Indigenous languages not having words for disability, many Indigenous languages not having words for disability that carry the deficit connotation perpetuated by the Western world. The tweet is, there's no word for disabled in Anishinaabe. Words follow concepts. So a friend of mine who studies and teaches the language set off on a quest to find out what the Anishinaabe concept of disability is. And then they say an inability or refusal to meet your clan responsibilities. And none of these things that the West thinks of as disability would prevent me from meeting these obligations in some way.
That's right.
So thinking about sort of that reclaiming and relearning of Chamorro in relation to sort of resisting these deficit perspectives that are like indexed in our language, right? And what we do and say every day. And also the reclaiming of disability as not a pathology, right? It's natural human variance supported in connection to community and land, right? And I guess in relation to the question of Palestine, reiterating that genocide is a mass disabling event.
That's right.
As COVID-19 is a mass disabling event. Recognizing that, I think Leah Lakshmi's work and Alice Wong's work and Amani Barbarin and you know, I continue to learn that activism isn't prescriptive, and that we all have something that we can do with the time and energy and community and resources.
That's so important.
And that it can look a lot of different ways, and that and also just in conversations with both of you, Django and Jordan, thinking about what that you mentioned, Django, as faculty being representatives of the state in some way, you know, recognizing that, you know, our activism isn't for institutions, that
That's right.
the point is to continue to find and build, to continue to dream of liberation where disabled people get to just be, as Lakshmi Samrasina says, and to find and build community along the way, continuing to resist the logic that some people are throwaway, and that we can, and that ableist logic that fuels that, right, and that distributes and withholds resources and act and life. And so thinking about yeah, uplifting the folks and continuing to seek and find the folks who are thinking about spaces where disabled people can just be, I think is
I really love that. And it reminds us that that the goal of sort of collective care or collectivity is to find each other, to be there for each other. As you were sharing there, Maggie, I was thinking about Eunice Romero, Cochiti Pueblo scholar, who did work a long time ago in the early 90s on giftedness in her community from a Caris Pueblo perspective. And one of the principles that she learned from a long-term work alongside elders was you're only considered gifted if you use your gift for the good of the community.
Yeah.
And so and that everybody's gifted is one too.
Yeah.
But you're only, you're only, and that was really resonating with the work you were talking about, thinking about Anishinaabe understandings of giftedness. So I want to thank you both for sharing with us today. I think this was a very important set of sharings, and I know for me, set of learnings. We hope that folks listening can take these learnings into your own settings, into your work and living with children, with families, with educators, as children, as families, as educators. I also want to make sure to thank our research assistant, Siada Padmore, for her production work, and to Caleb Albright for his design work. I encourage folks to look for our other episodes of An Educational Otherwise, which are on YouTube and SoundCloud, as this one will soon be. And as many have said before, another world is possible. Another educational world is possible. So peace and blessings, everyone, and thank you both.